So we'll begin with the blessing over study and then pick up where we left off. We'll catch a quick review and then we'll get into a second story. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'tosav v'tivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, Source of Life, for providing us texts of meaning. So the story where we are in chapter 32 of Genesis has Jacob anticipating his meeting, hopefully a reconciliation, but it could be terrible, anticipating reconnecting or meeting up again with his twin brother Esau, whom some 20 years ago or so, he swapped pottage or stew for the birthright. Remember? And then his mother, he tricks his father, and then essentially his mother Rebecca says, you got to get out of here for a while and go find a wife, and better you should go back to the home country and go to my father, or rather my brother, says his mother, your uncle, and he falls in love with Rachel. He works to win her hand. He is rewarded with Rachel's older sister, Leah. It's a surprise to him, and so he pledges to work another 7 years and soon marries Rachel. And in this way, Jacob has now two wives. He begins to amass a good deal of wealth, servants and slaves and cattle and heads of sheep and what have you. And as he prepares to take his leave from Laban and strike out on his own, he gets word that Esau is coming to meet him. They're going to have this encounter together. And so what does Jacob do in preparation for that meeting from last week? Do you recall? He sends gifts to Esau, sends gifts one after another that he should receive sort of in a rolling way, right? He receives some, and then the next gifts are going to show up. And in this way, perhaps he'll win Esau's favor, he'll wear him down. What else does Jacob do, anticipating Esau's arrival? He circles the wagons and surrounds himself? Perhaps, but what does he do significantly? He prays? Yes. At first, he also splits his retinue, right? Everyone who's with him is now in two camps, such that if Esau should come upon one, the other won't be lost, or all won't be lost. He's not putting all his eggs in one basket, he's putting them in two baskets. And now we get to the point where, in the final paragraph on the back of our text sheet, Jacob, again, anticipating what's going to be on the horizon in this meeting with his twin brother, now sends the rest of his material to the other side of the river, and now he's alone. And that's where we pick up the story. So before we jump into that final paragraph on the back of the page, are there questions or thoughts that came from last week or before, or that you bring with you as we approach this penultimate moment last week? Okay, so let's jump in under the heading Jacob wrestles at Peniel. The same night, he got up and took his two wives, his two maids, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok River. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. That's the first thing that might jump out at you, just in that verse, right? Seems to be a paradox, or at least it needs some resolution. Hold on to that, verse 24 there. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said, what is your name? And he replied, Jacob. Then the man said, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. And then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites should not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. So there's a lot going on here. Let's pull back a few layers and get the story And then let's also appreciate that last verse on this paragraph seems to have nothing to do with the story, but is likely a later addition explaining how it is that Jews practice dietary laws today. Does that make sense? That is to say, the story is the story, and there's a lot that's in there. That last verse has nothing to do with the story itself, but is an explanation for dietary practices that have come later that we don't know about in Genesis. You may remember that last week we mentioned a few examples of things that happened in the Genesis narrative that are later proscribed or are later given rationale that the earlier generation seems to know nothing about. Do you remember some of those examples? They come from this story. When Jacob marries Leah and then agrees to work for more years in order to marry the woman he truly loves, Rachel, Leah's sister, he has two wives who are themselves biological sisters. But later in Leviticus, we're going to learn that one of the commands is not to marry your wife or your ex-wife's sister in your first wife's lifetime. Does that make sense? If your wife dies, you can marry her sister. But if you are unhappy with your wife, you can't trade her for her sister. Right? But that's new information in Leviticus that the Genesis generations knew nothing about. What are two other good examples? We mentioned last time. Do you recall? The first is perhaps, we can do them in any order. The first is perhaps that in Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis opens with the creation story, 6 days of creation and the seventh day of rest, and yet no one in Genesis practices anything that we would recognize as a Sabbath observance, which is suggestive of what? As biblical scholars, we might square that circle by suggesting what? How could it be the case that Genesis 1 describes a 6-day creation story with God resting on the seventh, and we all know that means that's a Sabbath. And we can argue about whether it's Saturday or Sunday, but it's a seventh-day Sabbath. But no one else in Genesis knows anything about it, seemingly. We don't get any hint that they stop their work, they stop their travel, they behave in a different way on this day than the other 6 days. So how do we make sense of that? It was added later. Right? That's the biblical scholar answer. That it was added later. That this text we have that is the Bible is a pastiche or a mosaic, if you like the pun. It's a mosaic of all these different stories from different times, some of which are not easily reconcilable or are later additions. Another example is that when Sarah is instructed by Abraham to prepare food for their guests, she prepares a meal that's decidedly unkosher in that there's milk and meat. But we don't know anything about the prohibitions of mixing milk with meat until later. Right? So that gives us a little bit of insight into the chronology of how these stories get written or which ones are earlier than others. This final verse here seems to be an editorial addition that's suggestive of why Jews avoid certain parts of the animal or why dietary laws are what they are. Okay? But what else is going on in this story? There's a lot about names. So say something about that. Will you say something more about that?
Well, naming is an important thing. Like for you, the name of the deity is a big deal. And so Jacob having one name, now we're going to be called something else. But what is the name of the stranger? We don't know, and he refuses to say.
Correct. So there's an exchange in this match between Jacob and whoever it is that is this adversary or this wrestling opponent or companion. And in the course of the story, the opponent asks Jacob his name. Jacob answers that his name is Jacob, and he gets renamed by this adversary. We'll say something about what that name is and what it means. And similarly, Jacob asks his wrestling companion, "What is your name?" And he's denied an answer. Right? Different things happen. So there's something going on with regard to naming. Let me say something about the name Israel or Yisrael. We've mentioned before that biblical names that end with the suffix "el," Daniel, Gabriel, Abigail, Michael, all those "el" final syllables is a reference for God. El as in Elohim or El Elyon. in the Passion Gospel this morning that will be shared again at 11 o'clock, when Jesus is on the cross, when he calls out, Eloi, Elohai, is that sort of how it's pronounced? But the ale is in there as a reference for God. My God,
Yeah.
that's where we get it.
Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me?
Right. So the direct address for God in this case is Eloi or El or Elohim. They're all variations on the same, right? Which is how we get the name Peniel. The Hebrew for face is panim, or in Yiddish, maybe you've heard of punum. So Peniel is the face of God. So let's see where we can find God in this story, as it were, or where we can discern where God shows up in our own lives. The question here, as we read this text, we'll read it with a little more specificity, is to see where we are in the drama. I mean, it's a story about Jacob, okay, on a particular night in his life, one night, okay. But it's also a story in which we're invited to see ourselves within. Right? All right. You want to jump in? We're okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So let's go back to the story. How about that verse? What do you make of the verse? It's 24 here. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. He's alone, and then there's somebody there. So how do we make sense of that verse? If he's alone, he's alone. And yet the next word suggests that, in point of fact, he's not alone. So how do we square that? What ideas might you have, or have you heard? Yes?
It feels to me like there's some level of duality here. It's like that here is Jacob, and here is this other part of Jacob that he's struggling with.
Okay, so he's struggling with himself. He's wrestling with himself. You ever had a night where you're tossing and turning all night, right? Or there's something on your mind and you can't sleep, or you struggle, or I wrestle with this idea, or, right? Leon Wieseltier, former literary editor of the New Republic, used to say that when he hears someone is of two minds on an issue, he thinks to himself, only two? Right? Like, we're complex, we can struggle with things, we see things from different vantage points. So you can be alone and feel like, I'm not actually alone, I'm much with my thoughts, right? Or I'm much consumed with what's going on. So one idea is that he's struggling with himself. Maybe it's a shadow self, maybe it's his ego, maybe it's whatever it is that he struggles with, in the same way that each and every one of us have our personal struggles, whatever they may be. And you're never left alone of them, right? For a while it may feel like we are, or maybe feel like we're losing that struggle, or what have you. But significantly, and this is a fascinating part of this particular story, Jacob wrestles with this alter, ego, other person, angel of God, whatever it is that's going on here, and it's ripe for interpretation. He struggles all the way through the night, right? It's a long, drawn-out match between Jacob and the one with whom he's wrestling. And then how does the wrestling match resolve itself? How does it come to a conclusion? Yes?
What to me is very much like, it would be hard to wrestle with yourself and dislocate your hip. Your hip's actually what's hard to dislocate, by the way. I know this is like that in first book back.
Everyone hear that? Can you hear it on this side? Say it a little louder. We're talking.
So I was saying that hip dislocation is how it ends, right? And dislocating your own hip is really hard to do. I've done it, and it hurts really bad too. And so, but I can say, like, that was the idea that he dislocated his hip makes it seem like he's been struggling. When
Yes.
he's not, he's been struggling.
Okay?
You said it for the...
The idea that it suggested the wrestling match ends when Jacob's hip is wrenched or dislocated or strained, right? And there are commentators that say, well, it couldn't have been dislocated. He wouldn't have been able even to limp. It must have been strained, or it must have been whatever it was. That suggests, that physical manifestation suggests that it was an outer experience as opposed to an inner one, right? I've also taught that the ways in which Jacob is changed, the way in which he gets up from the wrestling match versus the way in which he put his head on the rock, one imagines, right, after his family and all those people had been sent across and now he's alone, is suggestive of the fact that, what was I going to say? That Jacob wrestles all the night through. And as a result, a number of changes take place. And that the hip socket change is, if you will, he moves through the world in a different way after this encounter. Maybe it's physical, right? But we can speak of our life's journey. That's one of the common metaphors that we have. George Lakoff, in a book called Metaphors We Live By, describes metaphors that we use without even thinking about it. It sort of just colors the way in which we imagine. So, for instance, we think of time moving forward. If you think about your own life, cast a review quickly over your own life. We think of it as, if you will, a set of cars on a train that line up one after another and move in a forward direction. So perhaps when you think of your life, you think of your childhood, or you lived in this place, or this was going on, and then things changed, and you grew up or moved out, or whatever it was. And we think of them as consecutive or sequential events, such that if we were to write the story of our lives, write our own autobiography, each car of the train could be a chapter of the book, and we move forward in our life. It's one of the metaphors that we have about how time is experienced. Similarly, Jacob gets up from this event, and he is a different person for the effort. He moves in the world differently physically. He has a different name, Yisrael. The prefix Yisar is one of the words for wrestling or struggling. And so the name Israel, or Yisrael, the name that Jacob takes on, and then in the chapter here that referred to the children of Israel, or the Israelites, now eat in this way or avoid certain things. It's the first time that reference is made to the Jewish people as the sons of Jacob or the children of Israel. That idea is new. But he moves in a different way. He has a different name, a different understanding. He's different for that experience.
And a blessing.
And he receives a blessing. He's blessed in so doing. Now, one more insight, then I'll take a breath, let Jonathan jump in. I've used this text in settings for 12-step programs. And speaking with folks for whom their struggle with substances or alcohol or whatever it may be is very real and manifest. And the idea that you struggle or we wrestle all the night through or over the course of our life's journey, if you will, and are credited, as is Jacob, with the win in spite of the fact that he wrestled this adversary to essentially what was a draw. They agree to stop wrestling. Let me go and I'll bless you. Tell me your name and we can end this struggle. But to be credited with the win or to be victorious for not giving up the effort. Think in your own life of something you've struggled with. It can be anything. Another individual, a relationship, your relationship to something else, and you are working on that, and you have been, and you know that that's your, or one of your, issues to master or to deal with in your own life. The win is credited to you if you don't give up the struggle, as opposed to actually winning on points, which is how wrestling is usually scored, right? Or winning because it's a technical knockout or something that's actually decisive. It doesn't appear, perhaps, that Jacob has changed so much. He didn't beat the adversary. He's wounded afterwards, but we might recognize in that effort something very different. Yes?
As I was reading this, it struck me that he was really wrestling with God.
He's really wrestling with God.
Not the same thing, but something.
Okay, so the suggestion is that he's wrestling with God. Maybe it's God, maybe it's an angel, maybe it's himself, but his struggle is with ultimate meaning or with bigger things.
Who does Jacob think he's wrestling with, at least early on? It's dark. He's alone. Did you mention all the people that were with him at the beginning?
No.
My wife is the best thing that ever happened to me. That's my context for what I'm about to say. But imagine if you've been 20 years with your uncle working yourself to death to make money for him and then for you and your family, and you got one wife, Rachel, another wife, Leah. They each have a maid with whom you've had a child, a son. So you got two wives and two, what do you call those? Baby mamas? Is that the right term? Do you have what kind of a concubine? Do you have a relationship with them also, presumably, because they're still there? in the story, and they're the mother of your children. So that's 4 different personalities who I'm betting are not always best friends forever, getting along at the family dinner table or whatever. So you've got that. You've got all your workers, shepherds, servants, guys doing the food, guys doing the water, cooking, protecting, and so on. And then you've got sheep, goats, camels, donkeys, whatever else going on. It's loud. So imagine being at the circus and you're traveling. Remember, you went there as a single person, penniless unless your mom gave you something, running for your life. You saw on this map, by the way, I had Ken print this. It's 450 miles you walk by yourself. So 20 years later, you're 20 years older. I remember what I was like 20 years ago. I was thinner, and my bones didn't hurt as much, and I just had more energy, and like everybody else. And so he's coming back with this huge menagerie of things, 400 miles of goats making noises, and kids running around, and people arguing. And you finally get there, it's like, he would probably not say Jesus, he'd say, Holy Moses. Well, that wouldn't work either. What would he have said? Oh my gosh, I need some peace and quiet. So he sends everybody else across the river. Leave me alone for 5 minutes. And there, it's dark. And he's alone, and then suddenly he's not alone. Remember what happened. Esau, his brother, is the one he's going to meet. 400 men from Esau have shown up. He's scared to death for his own life. He starts sending presents. Who does he think is going to show up in the middle of the night when he's alone and unbelievably vulnerable, by himself vulnerable? You can't call anybody. There's nobody going to come help. This is it. Who showed up, does he think? Esau is a very likely possibility. Esau came across in the dark of the night to kill me. Or one of Esau's henchmen, one of the 400. The first thought in your mind would not be, oh look, God showed up to wrestle with me. Esau is going to kill me. So there's the initial fighting for his life. And it's really clear, he doesn't ever clearly discern who it is, according to the story, right? Something else that's very different than particularly the way we watch movies and television shows. Notice how the wrestling match is described. What does it say? Almost nothing. It just says, it happened. Men wrestled with him until daybreak. No details, no body slams, suplexes, none of the wrestling things, no drama. It just happened all night long. Here's a little fun theological fact. If it's God, why would the man let him go just before daybreak? What would have happened? He couldn't see the man. Well, why? What happens if Jacob sees the face of God? He's dead. That comes later, kind of like stuff we're talking about. He would be fried to death. If you probably exactly like happened at Indiana Jones' Temple of Doom. It's a pretty good representation. The idea of that, when you encounter the holy, it's too much. What is Moses? Does Moses see the face of God later?
Yes.
Moses does, and it's so impressive, he's got to do what? Cover his own face, because it's reflecting the glory. And so you see only the back of God. It's too much to be directly in the presence. So in one sense, if that's God, God is saving Jacob's life by not letting him see the face of God. Or that would be it. Maybe it's an angel, so the story doesn't say, but one could draw. Initially, he would probably never imagine it's God or an angel or anything else. Somebody's come to kill him. And I will give credit to Jacob. He started out, remember we talked about Esau was the outdoorsman, the hunter, and Jacob lived where? In the tent with his mom. The intellectual, that's a kind way to say it, Allison. The manly man, and then the guy who lives in the tent with his mom. But that guy has been transformed, because I'm betting if you're taking care of sheep and goats all the time, protecting them from wolves and whatever else, he's gotten tougher and stronger over the years. It is impressive in multiple levels. Just say physical strength here. If you walk, can anybody here walk an hour? Probably. My wife can walk hours and hours. But if you run, can you run for an hour in a row? Used to. Yeah, used to. But there is a certain amount of just exertion that happens when you're physically exercising. And if you're really fighting or really going full speed, it's exhausting in just a short, brief time. So imagine he's fighting for his life, and he will not let go. There's a real credit to Jacob's character, it says to me. He will not give up, to Aaron's point. So there's a physical manifestation of that, but it's also, I think, the psychological, the emotional. He won't give in. Until what?
He gets a blessing.
Till he gets a blessing. What does it say about the nature, let's just say for the sake of discussion, that this other figure is God? Who initiates this wrestling match, this confrontation? God does. Why?
I think that there's a bit of a kind of an inversion of what's happened earlier when Jacob has, instead of asking for a blessing for this birthright, has subterfuge and gone and stolen that blessing, and now is having to battle and really persevere because he's asking to receive it. I think that it shows the degree of perhaps growth that he's had to kind of undergo, just from his personal wherewithal, that now he's working for it instead of trying.
Excellent. Did everybody hear that? Okay, the beginning of that part of the story, how does Jacob get the blessing, the birthright blessing from his dad, Isaac, instead of Esau? He steals it from him, basically. It's a scam, it's subterfuge. And that's why he had to run away to begin with. Now, instead of trying to steal a blessing, he asked for it. And notice, how does he ask for the blessing? Give me this blessing, darn it, or else. What does he say? And then how does he ask for God's name? Is that a demand? Please. There's somehow Jacob has gotten manners working with the sheep and goats. Is he fundamentally a different person? Probably not. But he has been changed over the course of these 20 years. This story, again, changes him again, quite distinctly. But he's growing as a person. So rather than trying to steal through subterfuge the blessing, now he's asking for it. And in fact, he won't give up until he gets it. Here's something else. If God was the one who initiated this, why? Why did God initiate the interaction, the wrestling match? Go ahead.
Jacob is a rich man at this point. Maybe wants to take him, God wants to take him down a little bit.
Jacob was a rich man at that point. Maybe God wants to take him down. Interesting point, Marianne.
I think God wants Jacob to realize himself that he has changed.
God wants Jacob himself to realize that Jacob has changed.
That he is changed.
That he is changing. Very good point. Somewhere?
I was going to say, Jacob must have realized who he was, because he said, I'm not letting you go until you bless me.
Jacob must have realized who the other opponent was, because I won't let you go until you bless me. At a certain point, probably.
And then God has the news for him that his name is going to be Israel. He was affirming that Jacob was going to somehow survive what he was going to face.
Yes.
Which means it couldn't have been Esau or one of his henchmen in order to say something like that.
Which means it couldn't have been Esau or one of his henchmen to say something like that. That's true. You don't know that at the beginning. No way Jacob could know. But as the time goes on, it might be, even though I walked into the 8 o'clock service, 32 people are there, and I saw a guy, his eyes were shut, it was a little dark, and I was like, I think that's Frank Allen. I haven't seen him since I was 22 years old. He was 2 years ahead of me in seminary. Surely it's not Frank. And then I walked back, and then I came up, and his eyes were open. I was like, oh, yeah, that's Frank. That's nice. And that's not my brother. That's somebody I knew for a year a little bit from a distance, and I recognized him. At one point, would you recognize it doesn't smell like Esau? He doesn't move like Esau. Because if they were brothers, don't you think they wrestled when they were kids? Because they're the same age? Stupid, that's my side of the line. That's my thing. It's my room, or whatever the equivalent was back then. Of course they pounded at each other, and then they ran to mom or dad, as the case may be, and blamed each other and tried to get each other in trouble. You'd recognize your brother eventually, at least his moves. So it's not that. Maybe it's a henchman, but then as you're talking, you start to figure out, and we all go through stuff like, you start to realize over time what's happening. You would never know at the beginning, but you start looking back as like, this doesn't make sense, now I get it, and so on and so forth. What does it say about the nature of God, that God would enter into this wrestling match? So God initiates. I'll just suggest that God is not, and this is, Deanna, our preacher is here, wonderful sermon today. This story shows God's initiative, God's interaction, as much as any in the Scriptures do. It's not waiting around for us to do everything. God, in fact, comes into the world, and interestingly, comes as what? An adversary, but an elephant or tiger? A man. Is there any other point in Scripture where God comes into the world as a man? Duh. The answer is duh. Thank you, Tom, on that one. The other word, instead of duh, you could say Jesus. That's the part of the point. How, if this is God, what does it say about the nature of God if Jacob held God to a draw in the wrestling match? Couldn't God just pull out superpower and pound him? It speaks to God's grace, which is, by the way, not a Hebrew Bible word. That's a New Testament word, way more than Old Testament. What do you mean by grace?
God is empowering Jacob in this moment to overcome all of those things that he's packed away back in the shadow, to overcome the shame, the guilt, the other things that he maybe has had to push down. And this gives him a moment to manifest and then kind of work through. And if God just pounded him down, then Jacob doesn't get to have that moment of perseverance and getting that blessing. He cannot reconcile.
So if those who didn't hear, and for the record, if God just came in and pounded him, Jacob doesn't actually have a struggle. There needs to be some work at it. There needs, sadly, to be some pain, some recognition, and all those things for Jacob to begin to realize through God's help of who he has been, who he is currently, who he's trying to become. One could say that about our lives. It'd be really nice if, we just won. But anything worth winning has a struggle to it. Any journey has a struggle to it, makes it more meaningful, more memorable in all those ways. Because it's the work, the struggle, that gives it the meaning. If you just win 100% of the time, it's not fun anymore. This is, to me, a fascinating thing about the life of dogs being studied. Do you know that like a Great Dane and, let's say, a miniature poodle, they'll play. What does the Great Dane do, or the big dog do with the small dog? He comes down to his level, often rolls on his side. It has been scientifically proven if the big dog doesn't let the little dog win at least 1/3, that's the rule, 1/3 of the time, then they won't play together. You have to limit yourself, because the other person's like, if you're just going to, I'm the big brother, bam, well, that's no fun for anybody. You have to let them think they can win, and you have a chance. Interestingly, the similar notion of God coming into the world as Jesus, does Jesus exercise all superpowers all the time? If you're the Son of God, if you're the Messiah, save yourself. Do this thing, do that. They're always trying to challenge him. He does miracles, but Jesus is also completely human. He is self-limiting. In the story, God appears to be self-limiting. So as a regular old guy to wrestle, so Jacob actually has to go through the struggle and learn something, as Kate's saying, about himself and who he is, to deal with the embarrassment, the shame, what we'd call the baggage, and all that stuff has got to come out. And that's a way you could say, is this great as a psychological struggle of self-realization? Yes. Is it also physically possible that this happened? Yes. Is it often the case that internal psychological struggle manifests itself in an external way? Yeah, most of the time it feels like. That's normal, in fact, of what's happening here. And so in the struggle, Jacob, as again to Aaron's point, wins. Anybody know baseball? Tie goes to the runner. That's what this judgment means. Just by, how did you say it? Sticking around and making it through is a win.
Yeah, right. Not giving up on the struggle is
not giving up on the struggle. One could say, because God is not ready to give up on Jacob. Is Jacob still a flawed human being at this point? Oh, really badly. Just ask his 2 wives and 2 concubines. Alison.
One of the things that Jacob did before, which is sort of seemingly unlike him, is he said, I'm not worthy of the steadfast love that you have shown me. And he's asking for help. So that sooner or later you figure God is going to come and say, okay,
So Jacob, in the longest prayer in Genesis, happened just before this. Oh gosh, I'm going to go meet Esau. He's got 400 men. I'm going to divide my groups in 2. Hey God, have you ever prayed? Don't raise your hand, because there's a camera. Don't raise your hand. Have you ever prayed, hey God, remember when you told me this? This was the deal. I'm just reminding you of that fact in case you forgot, and I'm really asking for it now. That was what his prayer was. And oh God, you're so smart and clever and wise and all-powerful. That's kind of how we talk. We ascribe an attribute. Oh Lord, who knows our needs before we ask. It's flattery, partly, but a reminder, because this is what I'm really asking for. He's humbling himself, but what does Jacob ask for in the prayer? And then this happens. It's on the other page, front of the page. Survival. Hey, remember I'm supposed to be the father of many nations and have all these people, and I don't get to do that if I get killed right here. And remember what you promised for this, all these nations will be blessed. None of that happens if you let anything bad happen to me. And so God's response, sometimes is silence. Listen to the sermon later. But what's the response this time? hey, come help me. This, you could say, sorry, help, thank you, or like the three forms of prayer and variations. And so he's doesn't really say sorry, not so much a thank you, but a help is what he's doing. And so God's response to that prayer is this story, because this is the interlude between I'm going to meet Esau and then I meet Esau. This happens. So why? I don't know. God could have come in many different ways to show this, but Jacob gets scarred, his hips thrown out of joint. I'm trying not to look at anybody when I say this. Do you have any scars or broken joints or markers of pain that have shaped who you are, for the better or for worse? And you carry them around with you. Baggage is another way to say that. Some of us got all the above and more, and a carry-on to go with it and the whole set of baggage. Jacob has that hip joint. He's got a limp for the rest of his life. Is that true?
That's how it's described.
He needs a hip replacement, but he doesn't get one. He has a limp. There are various things. I have right here a little scar because when I was 7, a big pile of concrete blocks fell and crushed me. And I don't think about it, but I remember the experience quite vividly when every once in a while I turn and I see that in the mirror. It's like, oh, wow, yeah, I remember I almost died then. Other things we are scarred by, we're marked by, usually more emotionally. Sure, they're physical ones, but emotionally, an event, an experience, a relationship marks us, and we carry that with us. It doesn't mean that defines who we are forever, but it's always there. As a reminder, what would this bad hip joint, this limp, remind Jacob of? The change in his life. He's also given, as Aaron pointed out, a new name, Israel. Is Jacob, when Abram became Abraham, was he called Abram anymore after that?
No.
No. He was Abraham forever and ever after that. Interestingly, Jacob is given the new name by God as Israel, but is he also still called Jacob some?
Yes.
I don't know why is that the case. Do we know from what scholars have said?
Well, scholars would tell you in a very rational, reasoned way, it's because these texts were stitched together and there's a remnant, it's an editorial seam, right? Or they didn't go back and clean it up kind of thing. And it's just a literary error, if you will. Others would say, in a more rabbinic fashion, would say that yes, he's changed now to Israel, but he's still got some Jacob in him. And sometimes when he acts this way, it's Jacob. And sometimes when he acts this way, it's Israel. Right? It's sort of like as we grow and mature into adults or into professionals or into whatever a new characteristic that we're ascribed or that we've earned, we may also betray the child or the inner child or whatever. Right? We have these ways of suggesting that when Jonathan asked the question, are we the same as we were before? Right? Are we the same? Are you the same person you were 40 years ago, 50 years ago as a child? Well, in some ways, absolutely. In other ways, no. You're quite different. Or you've had experiences that make that innocent youth a different person, or you're now a different. And yet, when we return home, or when we're with a parent or a sibling or others who bring us back or knew us when, we may toggle between who we are in the real world or who we are at home, or who we are in our family and who we are as imagined by our congregants, our clients, our business associates, whatever it may be. Right?
You have one more point before we go. Has everyone in here in some capacity received a blessing? I don't mean necessarily from a priest, but from a family member, from a friend, colleague. You've been blessed in some type of way. How does a blessing normally occur? You say thank you a lot. Think, is it a positive experience or a negative experience, usually? I would say positive for the most part. Like I go to Crimea and ask Natalie's dad if I can marry her. I bribed is strong, offered a gift of Kentucky bourbon you could not get in Russia at the time. Пожалуйста. And he's like, yes, you could marry her. That was a type of blessing, and it was a physical, like, hand-on-me thing and a hug, but that's what that is. Or they're blessings a parent or grandparent would give to a child. Here, we're paying for your college. We're driving you to this thing where it's a small or a big one. They're usually some type of giving one to the other, but it would be viewed as a mostly, if not completely, positive experience. This story is the reception of a blessing, but it's reception of a blessing through struggle, a physical and emotional and even psychological struggle. Think of, in your life, have you ever received a blessing through struggle? Yes. Is it better, worse, different than the other kind of blessing? Jess?
Sometimes it's better.
Sometimes it's better. Why?
Because you work for it, it's just a struggle.
You worked for it. You, in a sense, you didn't earn it. That, by the way, grace means unearned, unmerited. But you do have to work for it. There's a sense of achievement rather than just they gave me something. I had to do my part or more than my part. Anybody else received? Most of us received some type of blessing through struggle. Seeing that, I think, is one of the gifts of a maturity of faith. It's not readily apparent to most people that some bad thing happens and that you can recognize through it that you've been blessed in some way. Yes, there were awful parts. There's not to deny that in any sense. This was bad, that was unjust, that was whatever, unfair. But also I grew. I became a better person. So from this story, from the struggle, and then what happens right after this story? He gets a limp, he gets a new name, he gets blessed. The guy leaves, the man, the angel, whatever, leaves. Then what happens? He goes back, that's not next week, because next week is Easter, but the week after that, Sunday after Easter, we will have class. He goes back immediately to meet his brother. So you could say this encounter with God, wrestling, prepares him to meet his brother.
I think that was the whole point of it. He's about to get one heck of a promotion from Jacob to Israel, creating the land of the Israelites and all of that. God makes him feel worthy of that in this wrestling contest. Not letting him win, but even up all night long, and Jacob comes away feeling like he's really earned something, and he's gotten this blessing from God or whoever.
Jacob comes away from this struggle feeling like he's earned something, gotten a blessing. I 100% agree with you. I would add, however, you wake up from this event, you finish off, I got my limp, and then I got to go back to reality. And the problem, the huge problem I had looming, didn't go away. I still got to meet my brother. Now, I handled this guy, but I'm tired, and now I'm lame, I'm limping, and now I'm about to go meet Esau. So in some ways, he's calmer, but in other ways, it's like, I'm stronger, but what happens next? That's where he is. We'll pick that up in 2 weeks. Thank you all very much.